For the webinar topic, we are going to be going through advanced inventory. This is going to be a bit of a two-part series. So for today's webinar, we want to go through and talk about what advanced inventory is, what the different settings are, and what we can enable to use for additional inventory tracking. And then our follow-up next week will be to go through actual use of these advanced inventory features, as well as reviewing the additional reporting that we get and making sure we can leverage that information to properly track and manage our inventory. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. The first thing I wanted to go through is making sure we don't have questions on what advanced inventory is versus enhanced inventory receiving. I know sometimes these terms can be a little bit confusing because they sound so similar. So that's why I wanted to make sure we could first address what each of these are before we get into talking about advanced inventory as a whole. For advanced inventory, these are going to be additional settings or preferences that we can turn on in the QuickBooks system to help improve your inventory tracking needs. What enhanced inventory receiving allows us to do is separate the inventory receiving process from your AP and vendor entries. When we talk about enhanced receiving, normally the way you move through the inventory receiving process is you have a purchase order that gets entered into the QuickBooks system first. It's then followed by an item receipt that would be created to actually receive in your inventory. Once we're ready to pay our vendor bill, that item receipt would be converted to a bill so that you see your balance in AP and are able to pay your vendor. What enhanced inventory receiving actually does is it allows you to keep those processes completely separate. So what would end up happening is after we've created our purchase order, we would enter our item receipt the same way to bring in our inventory quantity. And then we would have a completely separate entry of a vendor bill to hit our AP account and establish the balance due to that vendor. So rather than having the item receipt converted to a bill, both transaction types would be entered and they are maintained separately. I know that might sound a little bit confusing. It may be a question of how do we make sure we're not duplicating information? How do we ensure our inventory isn't being overstated? QuickBooks handles that because it creates a clearing account when you turn on this preference. So what happens is an inventory offset account is established when we enable enhanced inventory receiving. So when you enter an item receipt or vendor bill, the offset to those is that inventory clearing account. So ultimately, that's an account that we would expect to wash and net to zero at the end of our receiving and vendor paying process. One of the things to note with enhanced inventory receiving that is different from advanced inventory is once this feature is enabled, it can't be disabled. So we always like to make sure this is a preference and a feature that our customers want to use before we turn it on. Luckily, QuickBooks will force you to create a backup copy of the file, so you do have that to resort back to if you decide you no longer want to use that feature. Some of the common reasons we typically see our customers wanting to use enhanced inventory receiving is if they've got separate people or separate departments that do handle those two different areas or functions in their business, and we want to make sure that they're doing separate actions inside of QuickBooks. Another big reason is if we are doing any kind of prepayment for inventory. A lot of times what we see here is a vendor bill will be entered so that the vendor can be paid up front for the items. What that ends up doing is it brings in our inventory quantities and overstates them because we haven't actually received in the product yet. So with enhanced inventory receiving, we can handle those prepayments without impacting our inventory quantity on hand. Another instance would be if we do any kind of partial receiving, but we only get one bill from our vendor. So as an example, if we receive in 3 separate shipments from our purchase order, we can create 3 separate item receipts to bring in those different quantities, but we want them all to still be maintained on one single vendor bill. Enhanced inventory receiving allows you to do that because that bill entry is completely separate. Right now, the way QuickBooks works is for every item receipt that you create, an individual bill is created from it. So this allows you to make sure that if we have any instances where we are doing any kind of partial receiving, we can still allocate that final balance to a single vendor bill. I want to come in here and make sure we know where that enhanced inventory receiving is. So if we look at our QuickBooks file here, I'm going to come in to our Edit tab and down to Preferences. Our Items and Inventory section is going to be where both the Advanced Inventory as well as Enhanced Inventory Receiving live. It's going to be under our Company Preferences area. You can see here, this will be the next area we look at. This is where all of our Advanced Inventory settings live, and then this is our Enhanced Inventory Receiving. So completely separate from each other, again, all working to help improve inventory functions, but I just wanted to make sure that we could understand and establish the difference with enhanced inventory receiving before we go through and talk about our advanced inventory settings. Okay, so now getting into our advanced inventory settings, we've got a handful that we want to go through. So the first 3 that we'll talk about are going to be multiple inventory locations or sites, serial and lot numbers, as well as expiration dates, and then FIFO. I'm going to go ahead and come back in here to our QuickBooks instance so I can have each of these areas up on the screen as we go through to talk about them. One of the things to note with setting these preferences is that you do have to be the admin user, and you also have to be in single user mode. So that is just something to keep in mind. Even if a team member has access to all areas of the QuickBooks instance, you do have to be the admin to make any preference adjustments. If I go ahead and click into here, you can see each of our different areas of our advanced inventory settings laid out. The first one here is our multiple inventory locations. You can see once I've got it enabled, there are some additional preferences down here that tell me I can have QuickBooks warn me about duplicate inventory transfers. What a transfer is it allows you to move inventory from one location to another. So a lot of times, as an example, our customers will have a main warehouse that inventory is received into, and then secondary warehouse or site locations that they disperse their inventory to. You can use this transfer in QuickBooks to tell it where you're moving those inventory quantities. Some of the different ways sites can be used are if we've got a single warehouse, and yes, I did say single warehouse, even though I know this says inventory sites. Sometimes our clients, if they have a single instance of a location or site, they still like to know the detailed location of their product. And what I mean by that is things like aisle, row, shelf, bin, and the site information allows you to do that. You can enable sites, and then you can also enable bins within sites. You can see here in parentheses, it gives you that example of adding in a row, a shelf, or a bin to completely depict where that physical inventory is located. You can also use sites if you've got multiple warehouses. Sometimes if we've got clients who have consignment inventory where their inventory is held at a buyer's location, they can use it for that to let them know where their inventory is currently being stored. Another example that I have is if you have inventory that's sent through any kind of review or QC process. I've got an example of a client who does chemical fertilizer, and they have to send the chemical preparations through a QC review before it's considered final and available to sell. So I do have customers who will put inventory in a staging or review site to let them know where that inventory sits before it's available to sell. One of the things to note when we're talking about inventory sites is that QuickBooks does consider inventory on a global scale. And what I mean by that is it will look at the overall quantity of your inventory. So for example, if I've got a positive quantity of 5 at my first site and a negative quantity of 10 at my second site, QuickBooks is taking that global value of my inventory, which in that example would make it a -5. You can still see that breakout of inventory at the individual site locations, but that is something to note. Another big important thing to look at here is making sure we're telling QuickBooks we don't want the inventory to go negative. So you've got the option here if we're entering a transaction and we're trying to pull from a site that doesn't have the quantity we need, we can have QuickBooks either warn us or completely block the transaction, which is the preferred method. Negative inventory, and especially negative inventory with these advanced settings, causes a lot of damage and corruption to QuickBooks files. So the recommendation is always going to be to block those transactions and prevent those from going negative in the system. Next one here we'll look at is serial and lot numbers and expiration dates. One thing to note here is that expiration dates can only be used if we've activated serial or lot numbers. This, unfortunately, right now is not a feature that can be used independently or on its own just yet. Also to note here, you can only enable one or the other when it comes to serial and lot numbers. We don't have the capability to enable both. I don't personally have many clients who do have the need for both. If so, usually we end up using something like a custom field to help track both pieces of information. Lot numbers, a lot of times our clients refer to as batch numbers. So even though you can't change that verbiage in QuickBooks, these would be identical to any kind of batch number that you're using when you're receiving in inventory. You've then got the additional transaction types that you can see this information represented in. One of the things that's nice with serial or lot numbers is it's not a feature that has to be used across the board. With multiple inventory sites, all inventory has to be received into a site location, be it an unspecified site or a holding site before you actually know where the inventory is going. All inventory must be recorded to a site. With serial or lot numbers, you have the option to tell QuickBooks that you don't want to make them mandatory. So if not everything you guys are tracking needs to be serialized or has a batch or lot number associated with it, you don't need to use them across the board. For expiration dates, this is basically additional field information that you can use when you're tracking your inventory. One of the common misconceptions is that QuickBooks will do some sort of flushing out of old inventory or an automatic write-off. While it won't do that function, it is still helpful to be able to see the information and the date associated with the inventory so that you can perform that action to do some sort of write-off or get rid of any old inventory that could be approaching an expiration date. I've also got clients who will use that expiration date function similar to a warranty date. So if there's anything related to that, you can also use that field for that information. The next one here is FIFO. With QuickBooks, it naturally does average costing for inventory. So what that means is As you receive an inventory, it takes any existing inventory that you have and the asset value of that inventory and averages it with the new quantity and asset value that you're bringing in. If you tell QuickBooks you want to use FIFO instead, it will work to relieve the earliest inventory that you have in the system. Unfortunately, there isn't any kind of override that you can do. If you wanted more current inventory to be relieved first, QuickBooks will automatically relieve the oldest inventory if this method is enabled. Also, a thing to note here is that LIFO is not an option when talking about inventory costing methods. The only two options you do have where you can set it from a preference standpoint are going to be using FIFO or the average costing. And again, unless this feature is enabled, QuickBooks is automatically going to do average costing for the inventory method. All right, now we're going to get into the second half of the inventory settings, and that will round out all of the advanced inventory settings that we can enable inside of the system. So the remaining three we want to talk about are barcode usage, which does have a coupling or pairing with our site operations, and then finally landed cost. If I come in here to our next tab, which is barcodes, you can just generically enable barcode usage in the system. There are essentially two ways you can use barcodes. If you've got a standard handheld device, like a Zebra scanner as an example, you can use that to just physically scan in the item and add it to your transaction template in QuickBooks. So for example, if you were on an item receipt or a customer invoice, you could scan that item, and as long as the barcode was set up on the item, QuickBooks would identify that item and add it to the transaction. The alternative for barcode scanning is to use the Intuit handheld device, which allows you to do more mobile functionality for things like customer order fulfillment or purchase order receiving, and that's where we get into talking about use of the site operations. So this first option here, the sales order fulfillment worksheet, what it allows you to do is separate out the pick, pack, and ship steps when you're going through and fulfilling a customer order. Normally, you would enter a sales order in the system for your customer, and when you're ready to fulfill it, you would create an invoice from that sales order. With this feature, you can actually go in and assign a picker who would go through and handle those pick, pack, and ship steps to take the order to fulfillment in order to provide it to your customer. Where that idea of the barcode scanning comes into play is if we are using that handheld device, we can scan the items to have it pull and show what exactly we are picking before we send it to be packed and shipped out to our customers. You don't have to use the handheld device. You can go through the manual process of picking, packing, and shipping the item inside of QuickBooks. One of the things that a lot of our customers do like with this is that a status update does get applied to the sales order. So once the sales order items have been picked, a picked status will show on that sales order. And then similarly, as we get to the packed and shipped steps, that status update will apply accordingly. So that is a nice feature and provides some additional line of sight versus just creating a sales order, potentially picking a pick list or a packing slip, and then moving it to the customer invoice. If we are not using the handheld device, the steps can potentially be a little bit cumbersome, but certainly can still give you additional information on where we're at in the order fulfillment process. One of the things to also note is that if we choose to use this feature, once an item is shipped, it doesn't automatically create an invoice inside of QuickBooks. We still have to go through and create that invoice to actually relieve the inventory and show the balance that our customer owes us. So that is also something to keep in mind. It will allow you to show that the sales order has been processed in full, but we still have to go through the step to create the invoice and relieve that inventory. For the purchase order management, again, the typical functionality is going to be using that mobile device. For example, if we've got team members in a warehouse versus someone working at a desk where they have easy access to that instance of QuickBooks, the purchase order management worksheet allows you to receive from a mobile device and input in the inventory that you've gotten into your warehouse. As an alternative, you can actually use an app on a mobile device like an Android to go through and receive in the inventory. The difference is that you have to manually put in the items that you're receiving in versus having that handheld device that you can use for scanning purposes to have it automatically pull on the purchase order that you're receiving in against. So again, with both of these options here, you do have a manual capability to go through these steps, or you can couple it with the barcode scanning features to allow additional activity from those mobile instances. The last feature here that we want to go ahead and talk about is landed cost. Typically, most of our customers who use landed cost are going to be anyone who works with an overseas vendor, or it can be domestic. It doesn't have to be international. If you've got high shipping and freight costs that you're incurring to bring in inventory, if you've got any kind of duties or customs, essentially any kind of additional expenses that would apply to bringing in inventory, landed cost is a feature that allows you to go ahead and update the per unit price of your actual inventory. The way this feature works is you would have your standard inventory bill to bring in your inventory quantity on hand. You'd then have a separate bill to your shipping vendor to pay for that expense. And once that second bill is in the system, you can tell QuickBooks that you want it to calculate the landed cost. What it will do in that instance is it will allow you to allocate that shipping cost to the actual item cost, and it will create a calculated and new per unit price on the item. I want to go ahead and show you guys where we would see that on our vendor bill. So I'm going to go ahead and close out of our preferences here. If I come up here to our vendors and I say enter vendor bills, you've got this calculate landed cost feature here. Also under our inventory, I can say calculate landed cost, and this will take me to a window where I can see my shipping bills versus my product bills, and I can tell QuickBooks how I want to allocate those additional costs. The other area where you'll be able to see anything landed cost related is on the inventory item itself. If I open up an inventory part here, you'll notice you've got a standard cost field that you can manually input information into. And then you've got a landed cost field. Right now this says NA because I don't have any landed cost activity related to it. Once I do, QuickBooks will create that calculated cost and it will show here. Please note though that this is a calculated cost. This won't be a field that you can manually update like you can the actual cost field. So that is just something to keep in mind. QuickBooks won't automatically apply this landed cost to the actual cost, but it will use this for the costing amount when that inventory is being expensed out of the system. Also, when we're on our item here, if we do have any kind of inventory site information established, you'll notice here there's a little preference that says inventory site info. When I click on this, if I've got any kind of quantity on hand at a certain site, QuickBooks will tell me what quantity on hand I have. You can also set reorder points at individual sites, which can be helpful to ensure that we're keeping the correct amount of an item in stock. However, like I said, if you set it here, QuickBooks is going to take that overall global preference. So if I said my reorder point was 100, it's not taking into account that I need a certain quantity at each individual site. QuickBooks is just going to look at if we have 100 in quantity overall. So that is something to keep in mind. Always recommend using this breakout at the site level so that we have more line of sight and detailed tracking on our inventory. So again, just to recap, if I come back in here to our edit tab and to preferences, we've got our advanced inventory settings, not to be confused with our enhanced inventory receiving. Those advanced inventory settings are going to be multiple inventory locations, so being able to track by sites and bins, use of serial or lot numbers, aka batch numbers, which also allows us to use expiration dates, FIFO as an alternative to average cost, general barcode scanning usage, site operations to have that pick, pack, and ship function, as well as mobile receiving for our inventory, and then landed cost to be able to assign a new updated per unit cost based off of those additional shipping expenses. I appreciate everyone here listening, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.